Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has written to lawmakers seeking more money to partially finance the country's 2023 budget. The amount of money the government has borrowed from the Central Bank of Nigeria has steadily climbed in the past few months. From December 2021 through to October 2022, I beg your pardon, the government had borrowed 6.31 trillion naira, taking the total owed the CBN to 23.77 trillion naira. Now, this 23 trillion is not part of the country's total public debt stock, which stood at 42.84 trillion naira as of June 2022. This is not the only financial request that President Buhari's administration has brought before lawmakers. He's also asking that they approve the restructuring of all the money the government owes the CBN. The suggestion is that the loans be restructured to a 40-year debt security at 9%. Many economists agree that the government is spending more on debt repayment than on education and health. But President Buhari has said his government has no choice but to borrow its way out of 2 recessions in the last 7 years. Joining me on the show now is Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics. Gospel, welcome again to Business Edge. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Tolu. Compliments of the season.
Same to you. Now, Nigeria is back here again, and that's unfortunately cap in hand, this time to the CBN once again, to borrow more money, partially for the 2023 budget in terms of the shortfall. But how much of a shortfall, how much of a deficit are we looking at here that we're seeing the CBN attempt to step in for?
Well, it's a very, very interesting conversation because more recently, the argument for the supplementary budget was passed. Was pushed forward, to the Senate, and was largely built around the food crisis and the recent flooding concerns, And we all know FAO had projected that about over 30 million Nigerians are likely to fall into the poverty trap, as a result of the looming food crisis ahead due to the flood situation that we had. So the argument from the federal government is to use these monies to sort of, reduce the impact of the flood on Nigerians, especially when it comes to the context of food crisis. But with respect to borrowing and all that, we foresee that this whole deficit may hit at least almost an 8 trillion, almost 8 trillion deficit, looking at it from the context of the 2022 budget. However, it's also a bit worrisome because it reflects also the leadership concerns that we have on the table, outside the fact that how can leadership begin to use fiscal instrument or policy instrument to properly drive a more strategic growth and development agenda. Although the government writes in the argument that since COVID-19 and the recession, it had to spend its way out of its recession in quotes. But again, that's still met with the concerns on high interest rates, increasing the Russian-Ukraine war impact on the Nigerian economy, and the oil prices and all of those narratives that impacted our revenue position. So it's just a very, very dire state that we are in, because we don't have the necessary revenue to take care of our rainy days such as these, and then we have to resort to borrowing. But the big catch again is, once these monies are released by the central bank and co, how much of them would really be used for real-time investment initiatives or investment cycles that can help, on the value chain of the agricultural narrative, to ensure that next time we don't have a food crisis. Let's not forget about almost close to half of the states are affected, and those are the supply banks of food in Nigeria. So it's a very, very mixed narrative, and it's quite unfortunate because what we're dealing with here is more of a public leadership issue than just a fiscal instrument.
Okay, so one of the things I found interesting in this is that in terms of the loans through the CBN's Ways and Means, they're not included in the Nigeria's total public debt stock, and that's at 42.84 trillion. But if you add how much the Nigerian government owes the CBN, it takes the total debt inclusive of the CBN Ways and Means into 66.61 trillion. Why keep it separate? Because it's almost like we're not adequately painting the real picture of what Nigeria owes and what the fiscal position actually is.
If I'm speaking in a particular way, the goal is to manage visuals, perception, and political correctness as well. Let's not forget also that the CBN, especially the way that the CBN is currently running right now, it's been in strong alignment with the core either with the core executive body. If you look at all of the policies that have been rolled out more recently, it tells you that there's a strong backing from the financial institutions, from the fiscal head, as it were, to help to roll out those policies in person of the president and the likes. And then we've also seen narratives where there is also need to control or manage perception around how much is being borrowed and where these monies are being borrowed. We also know that domestic borrowing has reached an all-time high, in recent times. But then again, that has been separated from what has been access to the central bank. It's likely a game of perception, a game to manage the story and how people perceive the Nigerian borrowing potential. But just like inflation, if we put into context how much is really being borrowed, we really understand that Nigeria is in a very, 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 very bad state, financially and fiscally. And but then again, you have a situation where the central bank is really not autonomous in this context and has to play by the rules of the apex fiscal institution budget. We've seen this narrative again, playing out in form of bailouts, prior to the pandemic, and even around the pandemic, there were a lot of bailouts by the central bank to states, helping them navigate the COVID-19 and all that, and that was the story. But I don't think there's anything that will stop anytime soon. It's just to tell you how, again, our public leadership system works, especially with the context of seeking financing from an institution that you can largely control than those that you can't control or those that may impact on your credit ratings.
So you've answered one of the other questions I wanted to put to you in terms of when we might see Nigeria slow down with the borrowing, but you've said that that's not going to happen anytime soon, particularly with an institution that you believe to be more largely controlled externally for the government. But let's look at something else. Now, Section 38 of the CBN Act of 2007 stipulates that the total amount of Ways and Means advances outstanding shall not at any time exceed 5% of the previous year's actual revenue of the federal government. But what we've seen in recent times is that the government's borrowings from the Apex Bank have repeatedly exceeded the 5% threshold. And when we look at how much Nigeria has borrowed from the CBN over the course of January to October 2022, what picture does this paint for us? You see things as 600 billion. You even see at one point, I think it is September, either April or August thereabouts, you see something over 1 trillion being borrowed as well. In terms of painting a fiscal picture for us, what does it say?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tolu. I mean, this narrative is very consistent with the recent assertions by the DMO DG, when she said that the debt has been spread for a longer term period, and as such, it will not affect there will be no pressure on debt servicing or repayments anytime soon, and all of that. I think it's just again being politically correct, and we talked about it in previous sessions this year, that the current institution is seeking to more to be politically correct because of the season that we're in, and then managing the perception around its fiscal position going forward. Another thing we've also seen with this whole narrative is that a gross underestimation of the revenue crisis that we face, and the lack of fiscal and political will to drive fiscal reforms, in real context to shore up the revenue base. I mean, Nigeria has all it takes, to grow its revenue. In H1 2022, non-oil sector revenue was at least 1.1 trillion more than the oil sector revenue. And that's a low-hanging fruit that's literally seated right there in front of us that we could explore further. But for some reasons, the lack of will and structural reform capabilities of the current administration, even previous administrations, have not been properly been able to ensure that we have a productive revenue structure, a diversified productive revenue structure within the Nigerian economy. So most of these statements are made out of, number one, they actually know what's happening, but number two, there was just a lack of context reality that comes into our fiscal positioning, fiscal announcements, press reviews and engagement, and then we'll see on the other hand that a lot of monies have been borrowed way past, that threshold. And it's just to tell you again that the long history of fiscal indiscipline has come to stay. And I don't think it's going to leave anytime soon, because that's more of a cultural problem, a public leadership problem, than just a revenue problem or any other way you want to term it. And it's so unfortunate that the apex financial institution has had to play along with the fiscal institution. Although in many ways you can't really separate the politics of the central banks, from the politicians or from the policymakers in the real context.
Okay, so let's stay with the CBN Act. some interesting things, what the act is saying and what the reality is on the ground, as you've also mentioned. So the act further says that all advances shall be repaid as soon as possible and shall in any event be repayable by the end of the federal government financial year in which they are granted. And if such advances remain unpaid at the end of the year, the power of the bank to grant such further advances in any subsequent year shall be excisable, unless the outstanding levies or advances rather have been repaid. So basically saying that if the money from last year has not been repaid, the bank is not expected to continue to advance money to Nigeria's government. But on its website, the CBN said that the federal government's borrowing from it through the ways and means advances could have adverse effects on the bank's monetary policy to the detriment of domestic prices and exchange rates. Now, we know a few months ago, the World Bank has warned in particular about this specific type of borrowing that the Buhari administration has been involved in. What sort of negative or adverse effects are we talking about, Gospel?
Oh, a huge one, a huge one. One of the major arguments for consistent increased interest rates, by central bank has been the need to, take out monies in circulation. That's one of the arguments globally. And for Nigeria, that argument is also further nuanced. Coming from the COVID-19 pandemic and all that, there were narratives that so much monies have been pushed into the system through policy stimulus, through policy programs, through state bailouts, government borrowings like we're discussing now. So it's a lot of monies in the system. So as a result, the central bank is trying to keep raising interest rates so as to, take out those stimulus packages or those monies from the system. However, the narrative, the narrative by the CBN institution has been that the monies in circulation are largely in the domestic market. That's around counterfeits or too much monies and all of that, chasing few goods and all. But then again, the big concern is how's the fact that 80% of your monies have left your vault into the system. One of the major routes through which these monies are permitted through the system are these sort of borrowing, and the consistent bailout for different Nigerian states. Let's not forget that almost 80% of Nigerian states are not commercially viable. Only Lagos and Port Harcourt alone contributes about 65 to 70% of total VAT collected at the central level. That's two states. So the big concern is where are the other 34, states and all of that? How much does the FCT itself contribute to its VAT returns and all? So these are big concerns on the table. So whatever is central bank routine only exists on paper. I know in Nigeria a lot of things will not play out, accordingly. And like we mentioned earlier, looking at the way the marital relationship between the central bank and the federal government has been so questionable to the fact that we've seen these monies impact on exchange rates. We've seen them impact on inflation, and we've seen them impact on the nature of policies that the central bank has been rolling out recently. And raising interest rates in a bid to manage money supply has also hurt manufacturers. It has increased or it has raised the access to finance narrative or concerns on a different level. Now SMEs cannot be able to, take loans easily from other credit institutions now outside banks because the interest rates are now higher. That's a major issue right there. Exchange rates are constantly increasing because all of these bailout funds and all of these free monies in the system that's been pushed, for one policy narrative or the other are exchanging hands at very interesting and very funny paces. People are stacking monies and piling the Nigerian naira, like no man's business. So all of these things have impacted key Nigerian indicators. I do not also think that the day-to-day spending of the average Nigerian were the major things that drove exchange rates, or the value of the currency to this nature. Let's not forget that if average Nigerian does not know what's happening on the export or the import value chain,
True.
He or she doesn't know what's happening on the oil and gas value chain. He or she does not even have access to the central bank Anchor's Boran program, for instance. How many agricultural startups do you know have access to the central bank Anchor's Boran program? So a lot of these initiatives and a lot of these bailout funds have actually messed the Nigerian economy in terms of money supply and how those monies have been rigged across the value chain to impact on exchange rates and inflation. And the central bank is seeking to now introduce policies that would extract those monies out, but would actually do further harm to those who were never involved in the mainstay of this story in the first place. So it's a very, 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 it feels a bit manipulative and unfair especially on the real economy and on the average Nigerian who's faced with increased cost of living crisis or a shrinking disposable income. But then again, you have the politicians going to borrow more or extract more finance from the central bank. One way I see this moving forward is that it's going to be largely self-destructive, and a lot of states may need to face their fiscal crisis alone when the time comes, because at some point the central bank is really going to run out of many ideas and many capacity to engage, as it were. In fact, it's already firefighting and investing into courses that make sure you don't have any business in investing. Like I mentioned in the last interview, the central bank is seeking to control its own generated crisis by creating new crises on the table.
It's just, the description of it is a vicious cycle, because if we go from CBN data and now we go to Ministry of Finance data, it shows that total public debt climbed 3% to $103.3 billion in the second quarter, and that was driven by local borrowing. And the budget deficit to revenue ratio hit 74% this year and could rise to over 100% next year. And we know it's also in this year that Nigeria's debt servicing costs overtook revenue. But we see government continuing to go cap in hand. And the Buhari administration says they have no choice. 2 recessions, a pandemic no one could have predicted, a Russia-Ukraine crisis some predicted but never really thought was actually going to happen. All of them are things that are affecting Nigeria's fiscal position, but it's a vicious cycle. How do we get out of this? Because 2023 is an election year. You're putting a lot of pressure on the incoming president. We haven't even added the subsidy conversation to that fiscal position as well. What needs to be done? Because this cycle will continue for another 2, 3, 4 years, gospel. And if the CBN runs out of money, the federal government cannot bail out the states. The picture and the potential of the disaster looming is one that nobody wants us to go into.
Yes, I really think that a lot of in-house cleaning has to happen. A lot of housekeeping has to happen, and it has to be such that whatever institution will lead at the federal level in terms of fiscally next after the elections has to be ready to face the heat. It's just like what happened in 2015. A lot of persons who came in didn't know what existed, and they campaigned on different promises and all of that. There's a revenue crisis. You listed all the events and all of these things. The Q1 elections will also intensify demand on naira, on local monies, and that would be state borrowing at a different level. Let's not forget that not just only states or federal governments have access to CBN funds. There are high-level private institutions, who are maybe partnered with state or state rolled out initiatives that are also dependent on CBN borrowings to run. There are institutions, there are private companies that exist like that. There are state initiatives that actually exist like that. So if you look at the pack of this drill, it's quite unfortunate it hurts the Nigerian economy, it hurts the average Nigerian, and it hurts the average real sector player. And this is likely going to happen, until the elections are over. Because monies will be required in the system. Forget all the limitations and all the policies that have been rolled out recently. The politicians themselves, through the allies they currently have in government, will seek more creative ways to get monies out of the system. And that in that order, a new level of money will be supplied into the system. Let's not forget the supply dynamics and the new notes. This will be an avenue to push more notes into the system. And what's going to happen is that upon the resumption of the next president, there are going to be a lot of economic issues, to deal with. More complex, more woven economic issues, with an international community that may not be so interested to engage at that point, owing to the fact that the world is likely going to get into recession the next year. Some advanced economy are already projecting core recession already and planning around it. So external borrowing is going to be much more difficult next year. Partnerships are going to be more difficult to scale next year. And then the local narrative are going to worsen as well. So it's a big task ahead for whoever resumes office and whoever he or she plans to put together as an team in terms of ministers, and maybe a reshuffling of the central bank would make sense to have. That's if it's not currently happening right now, and all of that. So I don't see it playing out well. I hope it's not going to turn out self-destructive, because in one way or the other, it's already panning out self-destructive. The Nigerian economy and the average Nigerian is already suffering for this at immeasurable heights. And I expect that something would be done around it next year. But then it's a function of who gets into power, actually.
And on the screen, you can see exactly just how much the government has borrowed from the Central Bank of Nigeria in the past few months, running up to October, January, about 704. You're seeing, so there's a fluctuation in it. Of course, February 226, March 507, April 112, May 569. And from there, of course, there's much more running into October, leading up to what is now a massive owings to the
Almost
CBN. Exactly. And so there are a lot of questions, but Gospel, we can focus on the money being requested, but that was not the only thing that President Buhari is asking of lawmakers. When it comes to this money, he's also asking Nigerian lawmakers to actually restructure and convert those monies that the government owes the CBN. They want to convert it to 40-year bonds at 9% interest, some kind of debt security bonds. Is this really an option? Is it not more of a situation of pushing once again the problem down the road, sort of basically just kicking that can down the road in the long run? How would this conversion and restructuring actually work? And is it really the best option at this time?
Yes, that's a strategy. And they're strongly aligned at the level of the DMO, at the level of the central bank. So they're strongly aligned on that. I mean, just how when COVID-19 hit, the commercial banks went on a loan restructuring spree, and the goal was to, seem as though they were alleviating the pressure around paybacks, the timing for payback and how much is being paid back, and the interest rates and all of that. But right now we've seen that with the worsening currency, plus interest rate dynamics, plus global uncertainties, those monies would, how will I put it now? They are going to have to pay almost double or times 3 or times 4 of those monies in the future that they've restructured, and that's what's going to happen here. The current institution, in partnership with the federal government, is taken to be politically correct. So the argument they're pushing to the media is that they are restructuring in that way. So it's not going to affect on debt. It's not going to impact on debt servicing. It's not going to impact on repayment. And we have a sustainable debt to GDP ratio and all that. The concern is only debt to revenue. Those are just unnecessary, ways to confuse the public and to sound politically correct. So, but with this narrative, what's going to happen is that the way interest rates are going up globally and the way the Nigerian currency is faced with global currency competitiveness dynamics, we'll see an issue that it's not sustainable. The current government is just trying to look away from its responsibilities and also trying to relax the pressure that has been put on it by international and local community on its borrowing spree. So by the time these monies are being pushed into the future, into the next administration and into the next administration, by then Naira may have hit 1,500 next year to the dollar. By then, interest rates may have gone to a record high. By then, the Nigerian economy may be worse off to a very large extent, be worse off than it is right now. And I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom. It's just that if it's going to be better off, you need to start seeing some things happening right now. That's just the way it is, right? There's an input and output dynamics that's not currently happening. So what's going to happen in the next 4 to 5 years is that the current administration at that time would have to be paying at least times 2 more, in terms of payback of these monies that have been tied into bonds and all that, in terms of the amount that needs to be exchanged, to appeal to the international community to stay afloat or to stay on the positive side of credit ratings and all of that. So the outlook of this event is not going to look good in the next 3 to 4 years. And by then, most of the players right now at the table would have been out of the game. So it's an unfair move, but it stands for political correctness within the context of the need to spread it. But it's really an unfair move, especially again on the real economy as we move on into the next administration and into the next administration.
And that's the final question I wanted to ask you. In terms of all of this, we can talk about the CBN, the National Assembly, the Buhari administration, but in terms of the cost to Nigerians, this is money that is generated, revenue that is kept, whatever it is. It's not the CBN's money. In real terms, it's Nigerians' money. And so at the end of the day, what is the cost of this? What is the cost of continuing borrowings from the CBN? What is the cost of Nigeria's public debt going up? What is the cost of the CBN debt going up as well? What does it mean for Nigerians?
Yeah, I mean, there was a joke somebody shared recently that, if the way the Nigerian is going now, Find out what the banks are doing with your money and start doing that for your money or with your money. So I think Nigerians, number one, need to become more literate and educated, around what's happening economically and how it affects them. Not just only complaining about the price of bread, but understand what led to the increased price of bread in the first place, and how does your money play in that narrative. So Nigerians need to begin to understand what's really happening. Pressure groups, civil societies, NGOs need to opt their game. It's not just an issue of holding government accountable only, but also having an informed citizenry. And this is very key, because if Nigerians do not step up to this, it's going to be a worse hit, and largely self-destructive, even worse than it is right now. So Nigerians need to be way educated, and then by being educated, they can make more informed decisions, meaning that their incomes, they can begin to look out for, rather than locking on your savings and you're losing on the value of your savings or the monies you have in the bank. You can seek to invest those monies, all right? And you can probably join a financial literacy institution who teaches on stocks and all of these things. But look for other alternatives. Like maybe there is a successful business around you. You can invest a 50K or 100K in that business, for a period of time. You can also look out for people who are doing more investments in hard currencies and begin to invest in that order. You can begin to invest in yourself as a means to growing on your improving your skill enough to be able to add more value in the productive workforce stream, and begin to earn more for yourself. You can begin to, there are 1,001 things that Nigerians can do. It's the same thing as well with businesses. Businesses need to also think of diversifying now. Especially those who are inflation, who are vulnerable to inflation and vulnerable to exchange rate, like food businesses. A lot of FMCGs are exposed. If you sell food and introduce packs of soup and trays of soups and trays of food, you need to rethink that business model right now. A lot of businesses have to begin to think of how to use technology to push what they're doing, to a wider audience. Some have to look for new markets. Some have to change the product or the stream of engagements they're currently running, into an industry or something else that relies less on capital, less on human infrastructure, and that can probably help them stay lean and all of that. So there are a lot of dynamics to these things. With the increasing number of Nigerians living in the country right now, fashion designers can begin to look for plugs outside the country that they can make good Nigerian fabrics and export to them. And in that way, they begin to earn in hard currencies. A lot of Nigerian businesses have to go open door now, so there are a lot of ways they can begin to run or manage through on the dynamics we have right now, because staying where you are and just hoping things will get better, it's not going to get better anytime soon. The economics and the signs are very, very clear, but then education is very key, especially strategic insight into how people can begin to move their monies and invest for the future is really key right now, because I really don't see this challenge getting off the table. It's just a play of economics and a dirty play of economics. And let me also say, it's not happening. It's not just in Nigeria. It's happening globally. It's a global issue. Big central banks are moving monies here and there and sign up to initiatives that profits them in the mid to long term in a bid to stay on the game. And there are a lot of things that are happening, in terms of the politics of currencies and how currencies are operating. And that's also impacting on the Nigerian economy and the decisions of the Nigerian central bank, and it will impact more on them going forward.
All right, so Gospel Obele, we'll leave it at that. We wait to see what the National Assembly of Nigeria will do. They are on holiday recess, but it is likely they will, of course, agree to what the president is asking for, because it's dominated by his party members. But we'll see what plays out. In the long run, someone's going to have to bear the cost and pay for all of this eventually, one time, sooner or later. Gospel, as always, a pleasure, and happy holidays to you and yours.
So much for having me. Happy holidays.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick time out. When we come back, we'll get you business news and, of course, a few other things on Business Edge.